Here's a guy to ask the atheist philosopher Graham Oppy what it would take to get him to believe in God.
For more debates, updates, and bonus content, sign up at thebigconversation.show. What about you, Graham? I mean, I know this makes it personal in that way, but do you feel like you could be persuaded by a really great argument, or would it take some kind of experience that just was somehow undeniable in your personal psychology or whatever?
In order to get me to believe in the existence of something, it would take more than an argument. It would have to appeal to some kind of experience. A concept with a referent that doesn't actually exist would be fictional. In order to demonstrate to me that something is not fictional, you'd have to show me some empirical sense data, or I'd have to have some other kind of experience to which the concept claims to refer. If you want me to believe in Bigfoot, you have to show me one. And even then, I'd make an effort to rule out the probability that what I've seen isn't some kind of illusion. I don't see how you could demonstrate the existence of God or anything else by pure a priori argument alone. Such arguments deal only with concepts, and since demonstrating something's existence means showing that it is more than just a concept, I don't see how they could demonstrate anything's existence. That's why the ontological argument isn't convincing. It tries to show something is more than just a concept by using nothing but concepts. It merely tries to tie the concept of God to the concept of existence, which of course is not the same thing as tying God to existence itself.
To kind of shift you towards theism.
So that's a really difficult question, right? I mean, at this point, people often, think about Hume talking about in the dialogues about the voice in the sky. So people ask, what would it take? And the answer is, I have no idea, right? I mean, I don't see that something like that, a voice that speaks to everybody in their language, right? That's just not in the cards for, our world. Right?
Yeah.
I also don't know exactly what kind of experience would convince me that there is a God, but that's because I don't understand what a God is even supposed to be. Theologians and apologists will say that God is some non-corporeal entity and describe him in such a way that fails to really set a concept into my mind that I can recognize as coherent. William Lane Craig often describes God as timeless and spaceless, but I don't understand what it means to say that something exists without existing spatio-temporally. So the first thing I would need in order to get me to believe in a God is a definition I can understand. The only definition of God I know of which I find to be coherent is the pantheist definition. Pantheism says that the universe is God. That's pretty coherent. I can even say I believe in the pantheist God, as long as we're talking about a variety of pantheism that doesn't claim that the universe is conscious. I see no evidence of that. So to get me to believe in a God, you have to define what it means for such a God to exist in a way that I can recognize as coherent. Then you have to show me evidence of that God's existence. It's still hard to imagine what evidence I would find convincing, because that would depend upon the definition we're working with. Until I have that, I can't predict what would convince me of the existence of the God in question.
So, and even on most Christian stories, that's not on the cards, right? So.
Yeah, it seems like what convinces most Christian converts are experiences that, from my perspective, look like they could much more plausibly be explained by psychological phenomena rather than supernatural phenomena. Some Christians say they feel a presence or they were relieved of an addiction. I've never heard such a conversion story that didn't seem perfectly explainable as being a material psychological phenomenon.
But if you did have, because this is the interesting thing. Okay, I did a conversation with Peter Atkins, who you may be familiar with, the Oxford chemist, who's a very different kind of atheist to you. Let's put it that way, Graham. And when I asked him what could persuade you, he genuinely struggled to think of anything that could move him from atheism to even slight belief in God, because even something like Jesus appearing to him in a vision in front of him, he said, well, I would just assume my brain had malfunctioned. He was so committed in a sense to naturalism that every kind of experience he ever had that someone else might attribute to God, he said, I would have to assume, my naturalism comes first, something, there's going to be some explanation. I could never consider the divine one in that sense.
I wouldn't have to assume that my brain malfunctioned if I saw something like that. But since hallucinations seem far more common than supernatural events, which I doubt we have any reason to believe happen at all or are even a coherent notion, hallucinations or some other kind of illusion are certainly the safer bet, so they are far easier to believe in. Also, even if I believed it were really Jesus and that something actually supernatural happened, happened, whatever that would mean, I would just believe that Jesus is magic. The fact that he can rise from the grave and appear to me today doesn't mean that he's the all-powerful creator of the universe. To paraphrase Christopher Hitchens, even if one grants all of Jesus' miracles, the apologist is still left holding an empty sack with respect to evidence of God.
I mean, now I'm not saying that's your perspective, of course, but I'm saying where's the kind of where's that point for you at which you would say, yeah, if that happened, I think I'd be pretty convinced that maybe there is a God after all.
So I guess I'm inclined to think about this somewhat differently. I mean, I've read a bit about conversion stories in both directions, and there's all kinds of ways that you can end up being led to change your beliefs. That, and it can be a bit like with Guillaume, accumulation of small things, right? That leads you from one position to another, and I just don't think that we're in a position, like I've been in a position to think about, what would it take? What accumulation of small things would it take to shift me from where I am to somewhere else, to shift me from being atheist to agnostic, say? What would that take? And I really just think that we're not very good at thinking about those kinds of things. We just kind of don't have a very good capacity for answering those questions.
I don't think we even have much control over what we do or do not find convincing. That's why it's hard to predict what would convince us, and also why it's hard to just will oneself to believe something. Sometimes if you deliberately cultivate an echo chamber around yourself and refuse to consider evidence against whatever belief you're trying to cultivate, you can probably convince yourself that it's true, but even then, only some of the time. The fact that we have little control over what would convince us of something makes it harder to predict what would convince us of something.
I'm not going to go the way that you said that Peter Atkins went, though I do think, given how old I am, that it's kind of unlikely, and how much time I've spent looking at the arguments, it's unlikely that an argument's going to come along. I don't think that we sort of come up with new arguments and sort of devastating new arguments so rapidly that there's going to be an argument that's going to make me change my mind.
If there were an argument that would change my mind, it would have to argue from existing evidence. An a priori argument, like the ontological argument, certainly wouldn't work.
But even there, of course, that's the epistemic possibility, right? I mean, I say this about all the arguments. When my claim about the kind of lack of persuasiveness of the arguments is also qualified by of all the arguments that we've seen so far.
Yeah. Guillaume, just your thoughts on
I agree that the likelihood that something fundamentally new in the arguments is appears and convinces Graham is low. I think that the probability is fairly low there. What it would take to change his mind, given how old I am, I would say, yeah, perhaps it's very improbable. Thankfully, the God that I'm trying to depict in my book is a God that brings about the very improbable. So I'm not losing hope that something might happen. But apparently my prayers that this show would be cancelled because Graham came with a different opinion has not been fulfilled so far.
Guillaume Bignot used to be an atheist, but became a Christian because of experiences that, if they happened to me, I would be far more inclined to believe were purely psychological rather than supernatural. To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.